In the winter of 1965, a strange and tense scene unfolded in the harbor of New York City. A French naval vessel arrived not to visit and not to threaten war, but to conduct a business transaction that would shake the foundations of the global economy. The ship was there to collect gold, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of solid gold bars. This was not a robbery, it was a bank run. But the depositor was not a panicked citizen standing in line outside a local branch. The depositor was the Republic of France, and the bank was the United States of America. Inside the White House, President Lyndon Baines Johnson was furious. He reportedly called the French President Charles de Gaulle an ungrateful old man. He viewed this act as a betrayal, a stab in the back from an ally that the United States had liberated just 20 years earlier. But in Paris, Charles de Gaulle sat calmly in the Élysée Palace. He did not see himself as a traitor. He saw himself as a whistleblower. This event, known as the Gold War, was the moment the post-World War II economic order began to crumble. It was the moment when the promise that the US dollar was as good as gold was tested and found wanting. To understand why France sent warships to attack the US dollar, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to a hotel in New Hampshire in 1944. The story begins at Bretton Woods. As the Second World War was drawing to a close, the Allied nations gathered to decide how the world economy would work when the fighting stopped. They wanted to prevent another Great Depression. They wanted stability. The United States held all the cards. At that moment, America had the only functioning industrial base left on Earth. It had the strongest military, and crucially, it held 2/3 of all the gold in the world. The American delegates proposed a system that seemed logical at the time. They said, let us make the US dollar the center of the universe. Every other currency, the French franc, the British pound, the German mark, would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. It was a brilliant system. It gave the world confidence. If you held a US dollar anywhere in the world, from Tokyo to Rio, you knew it was not just a piece of paper. It was a claim check. You could, in theory, walk into the US Treasury and trade that paper for shiny yellow metal. The United States promised to exchange dollars for gold on demand for any central bank. It was the gold standard, but with an American middleman. For 20 years, this system worked beautifully. It fueled the greatest economic boom in human history. Europe rebuilt itself from the rubble. Japan rose from the ashes. Trade flowed freely across the oceans. The dollar was king, and everyone wanted it, but there was a flaw in the system. A fatal flaw that only a few economists, and one stubborn French general, saw coming. The flaw was simple math. As the world economy grew, countries needed more and more dollars to conduct trade. To meet this demand, the United States had to print more dollars. This was fine as long as the US had enough gold to back them up. But by the 1960s, the United States was printing dollars much faster than it was mining gold. The printing presses were running hot to pay for the Cold War, to pay for bases in Germany and Japan, to pay for aid to developing nations, and most expensively, to pay for a growing war in the jungles of Vietnam and a massive welfare state at home known as the Great Society. The United States was acting like a wealthy man who writes checks to everyone he meets. Everyone accepts the checks because they believe he is rich. But if everyone tried to cash those checks on the same day, they would discover the account is overdrawn. This is where Charles de Gaulle enters the story. De Gaulle was a giant of history. He was the man who had led the Free French forces against the Nazis. He was a man of immense pride and a deep suspicion of what he called the Anglo-Saxon powers, meaning the United States and Britain. De Gaulle believed that a nation without total independence was not a nation at all. He hated the idea that France had to rely on the United States for its defense or its economy. In the early 1960s, his financial advisors began to show him some disturbing numbers. They showed him that the United States was running a massive balance of payments deficit. They explained that American corporations were buying up French companies for buying French car makers, IBM taking over French computer firms, but they were buying these real assets with paper dollars printed out of thin air. De Gaulle was outraged. He called this the exorbitant privilege. He argued that the United States had a superpower no other nation possessed. If France wanted to buy oil or steel, it had to earn dollars by selling wine or cars. It had to work for its money. But if the United States wanted to buy something, it just printed more green paper. It was a free lunch on a global scale. De Gaulle saw this not just as unfair economic competition, but as imperialism. He believed the US was conquering the world not with soldiers, but with inflation. The tipping point came in 1965. The United States was escalating the war in Vietnam. The cost was astronomical. The Federal Reserve was pumping money into the system to keep interest rates low and the economy booming. Inflation was starting to tick up. De Gaulle realized the dollar was overvalued. It was trading at $35 an ounce of gold, but there were far too many dollars in circulation. The real value was much lower. He realized the United States was essentially bankrupt in gold terms. It had issued far more claims than it had assets. It was the world's largest Ponzi scheme, and de Gaulle decided it was time to cash out. He did not do this quietly. On February 4, 1965, de Gaulle called a press conference at the Élysée Palace. The room was packed with journalists from around the world. He sat beneath crystal chandeliers, wearing his military uniform, and delivered a lecture on the history of money. He declared that gold was the only true money. Gold has no nationality, he said. It is eternally and universally accepted. It is unalterable fiducially. He announced that France would no longer accept promises. France would exercise its rights under the Bretton Woods Agreement. It would return its US dollars to the Treasury, and it demanded gold in exchange. The announcement sent shockwaves through the financial world. It was a declaration of financial war. De Gaulle was calling America's bluff. The reaction in Washington was a mixture of disbelief and panic. President Johnson tried to downplay the threat and sent diplomats to Paris to talk de Gaulle out of it. They argued that this move would destabilize the West, that it would help the Soviet Union, and they appealed to the friendship between the two nations. But de Gaulle was unmoved. He famously said that treaties are like young girls and roses, they last while they last. To him, the era of the dollar standard had passed. The French government began the logistics of the transfer. This was not a digital transaction where numbers move on a screen. This was 1965. It was a physical operation. The Bank of France gathered pallets of US dollar bills and notified the US Federal Reserve of their intention to redeem them for gold. The United States had no legal choice but to comply. If they refused, they would be admitting that the dollar was worthless and the entire global financial system would collapse instantly. So the U.S. Treasury opened the vaults at Fort Knox and the New York Federal Reserve. Heavy gold bars were loaded onto trucks. These were standard delivery bars for 100 ounces of pure 24-karat gold. They were driven to the docks and loaded onto ships bound for France. In an age of nuclear submarines and jet aircraft, the fate of the global economy depended on crates of metal moving slowly across the Atlantic Ocean. The French Navy was involved to ensure the security of the shipment. This was France's national wealth being repatriated. De Gaulle wanted the gold in Paris, inside the vaults of the Banque de France, where he could touch it. He did not trust the Americans to hold it for him. He believed possession was the only law that mattered. As the first shipments of gold arrived in French ports, the American media turned on France. French wine was boycotted, champagne was poured into gutters. The French were called ungrateful, but de Gaulle did not care about popularity. He cared about reality, and the reality was that America's gold supply was bleeding dry. In 1945, the United States held nearly 20,000 tons of gold. By 1965, that number had already fallen sharply. Now, with France removing huge quantities month after month, the drain was accelerating. Other nations began to watch nervously. Germany, Japan, and Spain all held massive reserves of US dollars. They were loyal allies of the United States and depended on American military protection. They were afraid to anger Washington, but they were also afraid of being the last ones holding worthless paper. If France took all the real assets, what would be left for them? A quiet run on the bank began. Central banks discreetly exchanged dollars for gold, trying not to make a public spectacle like de Gaulle, but trying to protect themselves nonetheless. The pressure on the London gold pool, a system designed to suppress the price of gold at $35 an ounce, became unbearable. The market price of gold wanted to rise, but the U.S. government kept selling gold to maintain the illusion. They were bleeding reserves to defend a fantasy. De Gaulle's attack was not only economic, it was geopolitical. He wanted to break American dominance over Europe. He wanted Europe to become a third pole in the Cold War, independent of both Washington and Moscow. He saw the dollar as the chain binding Europe to U.S. foreign policy, and by breaking the dollar, he hoped to free Europe. He was especially critical of the Vietnam War. He believed it was unjust and doomed to fail. He argued that Europe was indirectly paying for the bombing of Vietnam because the United States printed money to fund the war and Europe absorbed the inflation by holding dollars. By demanding gold, he was effectively defunding the American war machine. Throughout the late 1960s, the tension escalated. The U.S. government tried everything to stop the bleeding. Capital controls were imposed to prevent Americans from investing abroad. Tourism was discouraged to keep dollars at home. Allies were pressured to promise not to convert their dollars into gold. Germany was threatened directly. The German chancellor received a letter from Washington warning that by 1968, the situation was critical. The United States had lost more than half of its gold reserves since the end of World War II. The vaults were emptying fast. France had successfully repatriated enormous quantities of gold. The American public was beginning to panic. There was talk of a dollar crisis. Import prices were rising. The inflation de Gaulle had warned about was now appearing in American cities. The first phase of de Gaulle's plan had worked perfectly. He had exposed the weakness of the dollar, but he had also unleashed forces he could not control. The Bretton Woods system was cracking. Speculators smelled blood. And in the White House, a new president was preparing to take office. Richard Nixon watched the gold drain with a cold, calculating eye. He understood that the United States could not keep paying gold forever. He knew a choice had to be made between saving the dollar's reputation and saving the American economy. And Nixon was not afraid to flip the table. The stage was set for the final collapse. The ships had sailed. The gold was now in Paris. Dollars were flooding back into the United States, fueling inflation. The trap de Gaulle had sprung was tightening around the American economy, but the United States still held one final card, a move that would change the nature of money forever. De Gaulle wanted a return to the gold standard. He wanted honest money. But the United States was preparing to give the world something entirely different. It was about to sever the link between money and reality itself. The Gold War was about to become a fiat revolution. By the summer of 1971, the financial war that de Gaulle had launched 6 years earlier reached a boiling point. The physical transfer of gold from the United States to France had drained the American treasury. The images of French ships loaded with bullion sailing away from New York were a humiliation the American superpower could no longer tolerate. But de Gaulle's gamble had done more than embarrass the United States. It had triggered a global loss of confidence. The secret was out. America did not have enough gold to cover its obligations. The bank run was no longer French, it was global. In London, the British government was quietly panicking. They saw the same numbers the French had seen. The British ambassador approached the U.S. Treasury with a polite but devastating request. Britain wanted to convert $3 billion of its reserves into gold. They asked to do it quietly, but the size of the request alone would have consumed nearly a third of America's remaining gold. If the United States honored the British request, Fort Knox would be almost empty. The dollar, the foundation of global trade, would be exposed as paper backed by nothing. Richard Nixon was now president. He was not a man driven by economic theory. He was driven by power and elections. He looked at the numbers and saw a trap. If he followed the Bretton Woods rules, the United States would be forced into a deep recession. Spending would have to be slashed. The Vietnam War would have to be curtailed. Nixon realized the United States was constrained by the very system it had created. The promise to pay gold was a chain around the neck of the American economy, so he decided to break the chain. He summoned his top advisors to Camp David for a secret meeting. The press had no idea it was happening. His team, including Treasury Secretary John Connally, debated the options. Traditional economists warned that abandoning gold would destroy confidence and unleash chaos. Connally argued the opposite. He told the Europeans bluntly that the dollar was America's currency, but it was their problem. He pushed for the nuclear option. Close the gold window, end convertibility. Force the world to adapt. On the evening of Sunday, August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon interrupted the popular television show Bonanza to address the nation. He spoke about defending the dollar against international speculators and blamed faceless financial forces for the crisis. Then, buried in the middle of the speech, he dropped the bombshell. He announced that he had ordered the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. He used the word temporarily. It was not temporary. The gold window would never reopen. The Nixon shock was an earthquake. In Paris, the French government was stunned. They had won the argument but lost the war. De Gaulle was already dead, but his successors watched as the United States simply rewrote the rules. France had bet that gold would force discipline on America. Instead, America declared that gold no longer mattered. The dollar was money because the United States said it was. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Currency markets shut down. When they reopened, the dollar plunged against the French franc, the German mark, and the Japanese yen. American exports became cheaper. Foreign goods became more expensive. Europe paid the price. American industry benefited. This was exactly what Nixon intended. For France, holding vast quantities of gold in Paris was a bittersweet victory. The price of gold exploded. In the years following the Nixon shock, gold rose from $35 an ounce to over $800 an ounce. On paper, France made a fortune. De Gaulle's instinct had been correct. He had exchanged depreciating paper for an asset that soared in value. But his deeper goal had failed. He had wanted honest money. He had wanted to force the United States to live within its means. Instead, his challenge pushed the world into a fiat system. In this new order, the United States no longer needed gold at all. It could print unlimited dollars, and the world had no alternative but to accept them. The dollar remained dominant not because it was backed by gold, but because it was backed by American power. The consequences were immediate and lasting. The inflation of the 1970s followed directly from the break with gold. Without discipline, governments printed money to solve political problems. The age of stable prices ended. The age of permanent inflation began. For France, the Gold War was the last great act of defiance by a European power against American dominance. It was the last time a Western ally openly confronted Washington and said no. The ships that carried the gold across the Atlantic were the final convoy of an older world, a world where money was physical, where debts were expected to be paid, and where promises written on paper were meant to be honored. The legacy of this event is profound. It taught the world that the United States would always act in its own self-interest, even if that meant breaking its own promises. It taught developing nations that holding US dollar reserves carried a hidden risk because the rules of the game could be changed overnight. And it validated the deep cynicism of Charles de Gaulle, who always believed that nations have no friends, only interests. In the end, the Gold War was a battle between two philosophies. On one side was the philosophy of gold, represented by France, which valued stability, history, and tangible assets. On the other side was the philosophy of the dollar, represented by the United States, which valued flexibility, growth, and the power of the state to manage the economy. The United States won the geopolitical battle. The dollar remained king, but France won the moral argument. The instability, the debt crises, and the inflation that have plagued the global economy since 1971 are the direct consequences of ignoring the warning de Gaulle delivered in that press conference. Today, the gold that France repatriated still sits deep inside the vaults of the Banque de France in Paris. It remains one of the largest gold reserves in the world. It stands as a silent monument to the moment when France forced the United States to honor its debts. It is a reminder of a brief moment in history when a French president sent his navy to New York not to conquer land, but to reclaim truth. The ships have long since been scrapped. The politicians are dead. But the gold remains eternal, unalterable, and indifferent to the paper promises of empires. The Gold War is over, but the question it raised remains unanswered. What is money, really? Is it a promise issued by a government, or is it a cold piece of metal that owes nothing to anyone? Charles de Gaulle made his choice. And looking at the mountain of debt the world sits on today, it is hard to say that he was wrong. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you will want to be among the few who saw it coming. Thanks for watching.